years ago, Dr. Gabra kindly gave me a copy of the manuscript of the life of Ibrahim al-Fany, and I was studying the lives of the Coptic saints of the 14th century for my PhD thesis, and became intrigued with Ibrahim's life and times, which I would like to share with you today. And my deepest thanks goes to Dr. Gabra, and starting from Dr. Fazil and Stefanos, everyone at the St. Mark Institute, and David Muharrem. So in this paper, there should be a handout, I'm very sorry. I will talk about Ibrahim's life according to his hagiography and discuss its historical significance. So first, who is this Ibrahim or Abraham al-Fany? According to his biography, he was born in Minya Bani Hasib, which would be modern-day Minya, and died on Patul 9th, 1113 era of the martyrs, which would be 1396. So this makes him a very local saint here in Middle Egypt. And he was a disciple of Murqus al-Anjuni and a mentor or spiritual father to Patriarch Matthaus al-Miskin from the late 14th century. And I am aware that Ibrahim al-Fany is really unknown, but he is mentioned in the Majma al-Qiddisin Lementa Sanctorum with Murqus al-Anjuni and Ambaruais, his contemporaries, and he's also mentioned in History of the Patriarchs, Tarikh al-Batarika, in connection to Patriarch Matthaus. To my knowledge, there is only one known manuscript of this life, which is preserved, I presume, at the monastery of St. Anthony, and this was copied in early 18th century in Cairo. And it only consists of a seerah, a life, and is not followed by the miracles, ajaibs, as is the norm for the 14th century hagiographies. And I have divided the life into sections, which you will see in the handout tomorrow. So the introduction or the preface of this life starts by mentioning Ibrahim's death and his departure from the city of Cairo to die at his birthplace, Minat Bani Hasib. And this is followed by a long lament about Ibrahim leaving Cairo, about how we, I presume his followers, including the author himself, begged him not to leave Cairo, which gives the impression of the author being more distressed by Ibrahim's abandonment of the blessed city of Misr, which, judging from the descriptions, is Cairo not to start, than by his eventual death. And this suggests that the author of the biography was a resident of Cairo and also a disciple of Ibrahim. And also there is some confusion in the life concerning Ibrahim's place of death. The author sometimes states that Ibrahim left for Akhmin, not Minya, which, as you know, Minya and Akhmin, it's an entirely different place. So, and the panegyric of Murqus al-Anjuni, Ibrahim, and the disciples who died as martyrs follows the lament, and the introduction ends with the author asking Ibrahim for his blessings. So the account of Ibrahim's life begins. Here it is related that Ibrahim was born in Minyat Bani Hasib. Minyat Abu Fis or Abu Qais, which according to Abu Makarim in the Tarikh al-Kanaris is the ancient name for Minyat Bani Hasib. His father's name was Ibrahim, his mother's name was Sayyida. Ibrahim was named after his father who died before Ibrahim was born. And several episodes from his childhood are recounted, emphasizing his love of study, disregard for earthly materials, and yearning for monastic life from an early age. So one day, without telling his mother, Ibrahim leaves his home for a monastery in the south. His mother, believing Ibrahim to be dead, laments the loss of a beloved son. And this lament, incidentally, is very beautiful. So, observing his mother's grief, God sends a Christian man to tell her that Ibrahim is actually at a monastery, And she goes to the monastery in haste and bids Ibrahim farewell. And because her words are so heartbreaking, however, the monks persuade Ibrahim to leave the monastery, to remain with his mother until her death. And as you can observe, the relationship between mother and son, one of the favorite themes in the Coptic hagiographies, is evident in this hagiography as well. So after his mother's death, Ibrahim returns to the monastery of Abu Fana, which you heard from Sayyid now yesterday, and which hopefully we're visiting on Friday, and starts studying the books written about the Saint Abu Fana of Fany and imitating his life. And here the story of Saint Fany, which you heard from Bishop Demetrius, is inserted, how Saint Fany stood for 18 days, weeks, months, and Ibrahim tried to imitate his life by standing all the time while copying manuscripts and doing other things and never sitting down. And I think this is a testament to the legacy of the veneration of Saint Fany in the Middle Ages, because we know that the monastery died out in the 17th century, but here in the 14th century the legacy is very evident. And also the interesting thing about his life at the monastery is that among many other 14th century saints, Ibrahim is the only one whose studies are mentioned. Well, it's not his asset and his life as fasting, prayers, but also his studies, which is very interesting, and also how he copied books. And as you all know, the copying of the manuscripts, it is a pastime of the monks, and also a very important occupation of the monks in the Ottoman period. And here it is interesting to note that Ibrahim seems to have pursued this occupation, and I'll come back to this later. And during this period, Ibrahim is ordained a priest while still a youth by a bishop who is always studying in the library with him. And this reference to his young age is rather ironic, because in the history of the patriarchs, Ibrahim is reported to have protested against the future patriarch Martaus's ordination as a priest, arguing that he is too young. But Ibrahim is ordained a priest while young. And in the 13th century, a marking notes that the children were being ordained as deacons. And here they're not children, they're youths, but still maybe these ordinations of young men were a matter of debate in the medieval times, which I would like to ask your opinion. But this idyllic period at the monastery is cut short when a disaster strikes the Christians of Egypt, and I believe this incident alludes to either the persecution of 1354 or the Cyprian Crusade of 1365, but I'm not sure. So here it is related that although most monks leave the monastery to go into hiding, Ibrahim refused to do so, leading to his arrest and torture by a local official. And it also narrates how the authorities tried to make him abandon his religion, Christianity, which brings to mind the narratives of the martyrdoms. The soldiers tie Ibrahim behind a forks, drags him around from village to village, and the villagers try to pay a bribe to the official to stop the beatings. But Ibrahim expresses his joy at experiencing the same sufferings as Christ. So, the martyrdoms. And after his release, Ibrahim returns to the monastery, and it is explained here that his fame, due to his sufferings in the name of Christ, spreads around Upper Egypt, and many priests, deacons, and the believers come to him to confess. And this moves him to the next stage of his life, his cursing of an unrepentant deacon. And Ibrahim's curse causes the deacon's death, much to Ibrahim's anguish. This cursing, it is one of the elements of the 14th century hagiographies as well. and Ibrahim leaves the monastery and starts living in solitude outside Akhmin. And he lives at Akhmin for many years, and here he hears about Morcos and Tsuji and goes to him. And upon meeting Ibrahim, Morcos weeps and admonishes him about the importance of forgiveness. And when Ibrahim decides to leave Akhmin and visits Morcos, and this theme of forgiveness for the sins at Ibrahim's meeting with Morcos is related, also mentioned in the life of Morcos al-Azuni. And after this episode, Ibrahim's time with Morcos at the monastery of St. Anthony, despite the demons and Morcos' eventual death, are narrated. And as these stories are basically in accordance with the life of Morcos al-Azuni, it can be assumed that the author had access to the life when compiling Ibrahim's biography. And during this time, Ibrahim is appointed as Morcos' successor, and after Morcos' death, Ibrahim travels to Cairo to meet his disciples, one of whom is Patriarch Matthias. And here the narrative changes slightly, and many miracles attributed to Ibrahim are inserted, which gives us an impression that either the author witnessed the accounts of himself or the inhabitants of Cairo described the miracles to him. And this supports my suggestion of the author being an inhabitant of Cairo. In terms of appearance, Ibrahim is described as bearing resemblance to the prophet Aaron. His face was shining with snow-white hair and a beard. People who met him were struck by his nobleness and humility. The description of his appearance is followed by various episodes of Ibrahim's time in Cairo, his prophecies of a young man's death, his cautioning of a tax collector to cheat, farmers asking him to come to their villages to bless the crops, Ibrahim praying for the Nile to rise in the Bukhara region, and so on. There's even an episode about Ibrahim's prophecy about the fate of Cairo. At the battle between the Ottomans and Tamerlane is mentioned, which would allude to the Battle of Ankara in 1402, which suggests that this hagiography was compiled around a few years after Ibrahim's death. Ibrahim died in 1396. The Battle of Ankara is 1402. This hagiography was written when still this battle was vivid in memory. We now come to the last stage of Ibrahim's life, his illness and death. Having realized that he is near death, Ibrahim expresses a wish to return to his native village, much to the Cairanians' distress. Upon his arrival at the villagers rejoice, thinking that he has come to stay. However, Ibrahim dies after just a few days with his disciples at his side. He was buried at the church of Abu Fis in the manuscript, or according to Abu Makarim, Abu Qais, at Minya Bani Hasib, next to the bishop who ordained him as a priest. And although this church is mentioned by Abu Makarim, but not in Makrizi's Hittat of the 15th century, it suggests that this church was destroyed in the 15th century, and perhaps this was one of the reasons why Ibrahim is not so well known today. Maybe his tomb is missing. If someone who knows about Minya could tell me about this, I'll be very grateful. And he was mourned by the Patriarch Matthias at the monastery of Shahran outside Cairo, as well as the monastery of St. Anthony. So, if the episodes of Ibrahim's life echo that of the past fathers, and as a monk's life, well, Ibrahim's life might be considered rather ordinary or insignificant. And in some ways, Ibrahim may seem as playing second fiddle to Morcos and Fany or Patriarchs Matthias, who are much bigger figures than him. But nevertheless, he was unique and was deeply mourned by the people of Cairo. As I mentioned before, it is difficult to tell which the author is lamenting more, Ibrahim's death or his abandonment of Cairo. For the author, Ibrahim's life needed to be commemorated as an individual work. So, what is the significance of Ibrahim's story? And in short, it serves as a witness account of the conditions of the Coptic community, of the era in which he lived and his hagiography was written, the late 14th century. The late 14th century, the period, witnessed the persecution of the Christians and Jews in Egypt. However, there are very few accounts of the era written by the Copts themselves, and we mostly have to rely on the accounts of the 15th century Muslim historian al-Makrizi, who I must point out is much of a storyteller than a historian when writing about the Copts. His narratives are reliable, but when he's talking about the Copts, his works should be treated carefully and skeptically. And the life of Ibrahim, together with that of Morcos al-Antuni, Ruwais, and the Ruwais Patriarch Maktaus, gives us a glimpse of what the Copts were experiencing at the time and how they perceived such events. In addition, the composition of these hagiographies of the contemporary holy men suggests that the late 14th century was not a barren period for Coptic literature as previously thought to be. First, Ibrahim's life is significant because it describes the persecutions in Upper Egypt, persecutions that some scholars believe to be limited to Cairo. On the other hand, this life is a testimony of a thriving monastic life, the continuation of the monastic life into the 14th century. The monastery of St. Anthony, monastery of Abu Fany, and also here at Deir al-Muhadrar, they were filled with monks. And this is in stark contrast to the accounts of the abandoned monasteries and destitute monks of the 16th century. Moreover, it is a testimony of active Coptic community in Cairo despite the persecutions, with Patriarch Maktaus in the center, and supports the contents of the life of Patriarch Maktaus. Second, this life is a beautifully executed work, evidence of the vibrant literary activities of the Coptic Church in the late 14th century. And as Dr. Johanna has pointed out, that the Coptic community was very much active during this period, and as the production of the manuscripts demonstrates, and Ibrahim himself was engaged in producing manuscripts. Although the 14th century cannot be compared to the 12th and the 13th century, the golden age of Christian Arabic literature, I would like to point out that the late 14th century was a period in which the Coptic synaxle was completed. And we all know that the 8th century witnessed a boom in the compilation and copying of martyrologies. Based on my studies of the lives of the contemporary holy men, I suggest that in the 14th century, the literary activity of the Coptic Church was focused on recording the lives of the saints, perhaps hand in hand with the compilation of the synaxle. Dr. Mark Swanson called this period the Age of the Saints, and I believe that this is a unique period in Coptic history after the Islamic conquest, in which individual lives of contemporary holy men were compiled, and I'm aware of 8 such lives. There may be more. I'm hoping there are more. The miracles of the holy men are mentioned in the history of the patriarchs, but very few individual lives exist outside a century, making this period exceptional. Each saint's life, his miracles, the role he played in the Coptic community varies in its own way. This period, the power of the patriarch was weak. Many Copts were converting to Islam, but the Coptic community, along with its clergy and notably the Alphons, was still functioning and chose the lives of the holy men to be a model for the Christians to follow. maybe in competition with the Muslim saints who were becoming active and inactive, and were also performing miracles very closely related to the Coptic saints. And this is a theory I'm presenting in my PhD thesis, and would like to ask you your opinions. In terms of Christian-Muslim relationship, the 14th century is regarded as an era of mass conversion, and the diminishing of the Coptic community is taken for granted. Maybe this is not so prevalent in the Coptic studies, but in Islamic historiography, this has been the main narrative since Gastonvier's article nearly a century ago. However, as Dr. Mark Swanson notes in his book, The Coptic Papacy, we should focus more on the survival of the church during this period. And I believe that the compilation of the saints' lives played a major role in the survival strategy, uniting the people with the experiences of the saints. And Ibrahim's life and biography is one such story of resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are indeed grateful for this important contribution.
Alimi.
So thank you very much for this important contribution. And I believe the Mamluk period still needs a lot of studies. It is a very critical period for the Copts. So also in art, I hope that there is a student preparing a PhD in the art of the Copts in the Mamluk period. And this is a very important contribution. So we have 5 minutes for